Video Lesson 2.1, Intro to Ancient China. This is our first flip video of our second unit, which will be all about ancient Eastern powers, such as China and Japan and India. So we're starting with China. Civilization first developed in the river valleys or North Plain region of ancient China. And civilization actually began to develop here between 12,000 and 2200 BCE. So way farther back in time than we've been talking about. And I'm going to kind of overview a couple of the major eras before we get to really be detailed with how we talk about ancient China as a civilization. So the Bronze Age was with the Xia Dynasty. That's Xia is pronounced Xia. And that was 2200 to 1750 BCE. Remember, when we're talking about BCE, time kind of counts backwards because it's counting up to 0, just like if you had negative numbers on a number line. And then we have the Shang Dynasty, and we're going to talk about what a dynasty is in just a minute. And the Shang Dynasty lasted from about 1750 BC to about 1040 BC. And these are named after the ruling families that ruled China or ruled the civilization during this time. And we don't know much about these civilizations because the Xia, we call it the Bronze Age because they just used a lot of bronze tools. So archaeologists have found a lot of these bronze tools, but we don't actually know very much about the culture of the Xia or anything like that. But we do know something about the culture of the Shang. And like I said before, these were mostly in the North China Plain region. So you can see here that we have the Shang Dynasty is where it's colored kind of orange. And then after the Shang is the Zhou. So it's kind of like Zhou, but with a softer J. That's how that ZH is pronounced, the Zhou Dynasty. And they last from about 1027 to 256 BC. And you can see they expanded the territory a bit to include what's in yellow. And we'll talk about the Qin and the Han later. So just to put this in context with what we've already talked about in terms of Mesoamerica, the Shang Dynasty started all the way back here. So we have our number line, right, with the year 0 sort of in the middle. The Shang Dynasty all the way back in 2200 to 1750 BC. And then China wasn't unified. It existed as several different city-states until 221 BC. So about 200 years before we typically start our timeline with the birth of Jesus. And then we don't, until 1200 years after that, that's when the Aztec and Inca begin. So there was civilization in Mesoamerica before that, but about 3,000 years exist between the Shang Dynasty, the first really well-known dynasty in China, until the Aztecs. So that's about 6 times as much time exists between us and the Aztec. So the Aztec and the Inca were conquered around 1500, about 300 years later, and then we have 2014. And this is roughly to scale. So you can see that we are just about as far away from biblical times as the biblical times are from the Shang Dynasty. So we are talking way farther back in time. Okay, so we're going to start with talking about the Shang Dynasty because this is really where Chinese civilization starts to come together and really come clear in terms of what we can find out about them. And mostly this is because they invented writing. So they also used glyphs similar to the Maya and the Inca, or the Maya and the Aztecs, but their glyphs are pretty similar to the ones used today. You can see them on the picture on the right. And this happened, remember I said this was about 2000 BC, so about 2,500 years before the Maya writing system existed. They also practiced ancestor worship. So that meant that when their ancestors died, they believed they went into heaven and became a god. And those gods were very personal to them because they were their ancestors. So each person kind of worshipped a different set of gods because they worshipped their ancestors. And family was very, very important to these ancient Chinese people. And because of that, there was an emphasis on community rather than the individual. In our society, we focus on the individual and not so much as the community. In Eastern societies and belief systems, there's an emphasis more on what is for the good of community rather than the good of the self. And they're also more secular than other civilizations. Secular means non-religious. So think about our government. We have a separation of church and state. The state, or the government, is secular, which means religion is kept separate from it. So it's not against religion, it's just not religious. So it's like saying school. School is a secular institution for us. But if you go to Catholic school, it's a religious institution. So they're kind of separated that way. So it's looking more at the world around them and nature and things of that sort than focusing on gods or sacrifice or rituals or other religious activities. And they also use jade, which is a green stone, and bronze in their technology. So they had certain tools and weapons that were made out of jade and bronze that they used. So the Shang Dynasty, like I said, doesn't last forever. And one of these reasons is because of this creation of this concept known as the mandate of heaven. So this is the idea that gods give rulers power and the authority to rule China. And it's used to legitimize the rule of ruling families in China. So when the Shang Dynasty started to not be doing so well, a family called the Zhou started claiming that the heaven, or gods, were mandating or ordering that they be the ones to rule. So the Zhou Dynasty used this argument to claim the right to the throne over the Shang. They said it was the will of the gods, and so they defeated the Shang, and they became the new ruling family. And these ruling families, which we're going to talk about in a minute, are called dynasties. So the mandate of heaven is what dynasties use to argue that they have the power to either take the throne, maintain the throne, or that they should another family should no longer have the throne. They say it's the will of the gods, mandate of heaven. And so the Zhou lasted from 1046, 800 years, to 256 BC. So more about dynasties and what we call a dynastic cycle. A dynasty is a family of rulers. So you may have heard this word before. And so rule is hereditary in a dynasty, which means it is passed down through the family. And the length of time a certain family is in power is also known as its dynasty. So for example, the Shang family was the family in power during the Shang dynasty. When I was referring to that before, I meant all the rulers came from the Shang family. And then a different family argued that they should be the rulers, so then it became the Zhou dynasty, and that's a different era. And the way that these families claim that they have power, so all of these Xia, Shang, Zhou, Qin, Han, Sui, Tang, these are all going to be dynasties we talk about. But for now, let's stick with the Shang and the Zhou. So the Shang was in power. So they had the mandate of heaven. They had the will of God on their side. So the dynasty is founded. That means it's established. And then it does better and better and better until it eventually peaks or reaches its prosperity. So all the first emperors are usually really good at what they do, really good at governing their society. And when order starts to become disturbed and there's more violence, more crime, more unrest within the society, then the dynasty starts to go in decline. And another family will found their dynasty and claim that they have the mandate of heaven and therefore the right to rule. So then the Zhou would start all over again and work its way up to the peak of the dynastic cycle, and then they would also decline, and then so on and so forth. So it's kind of a rotating cycle of dynasties. So that brings us to the 7 warring states period. So The Zhou, after they claimed the Mandate of Heaven, worked their way up, they peaked, and then they started to become in decline. China was kind of set up in this city-state system similar to the Maya. So you can see on the map all the different colors of the territories of the different city-states. And these city-states were each ruled by a different dynasty. So typically the center of civilization was the one that we remember. So the Shang and the Zhou are really where the urban centers of these ancient civilizations were. And the other city-states were more kind of in the countryside, and so they weren't necessarily the ones with the most power. So these dynasties, after the Zhou started to become in decline, they were constantly at war for many years, and they were all arguing that they had the Mandate of Heaven and should rule the entire civilization. So there was constant warfare between these 7 states: the Qin, the Wei, the Han, the Zhou, the Yan, the Qi, and the Chu. It was actually the Qin that this Qin, which is pronounced Qin, that dynasty was eventually victorious and united China for the first time under one emperor. So for the first time we had one entire China, which is why we call it China. It's after this Qin dynasty because they were the first ones to unite all these city-states under one emperor, which ended this period of constant violence and warfare between all these 7 city-states. And now we have China. Okay, the end.